Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. And I guess we have waited enough and we can start. So, hello, my name is Divyanshi and I'm the WINC's graduate advisor. WINC stands for Women in Computing, and we are an organization that focuses on celebrating, supporting, and empowering women, non binary, and underrepresented groups in computer science. We want to celebrate a community where you feel comfortable learning, connecting, and growing with us, not just in technical and academic aspects, but personal aspects as well. That being said, we are back with the second installment of graduate student led webinars, and the topic today is History of Women's Role in Computing Architectures. Our presenter today is Marcus, and Marcus, please take it away from here, and I will stop sharing now.
All right, thank you. Let me share. All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you're all doing good. Staying safe, staying healthy. Hope your semester hasn't been too terrible. This talk, I've kind of titled it Sustainable Computing Architectures. It kind of is going to go, I don't know, I feel kind of all over the place, but it'll be hopefully what I aim to do is give like an introduction of the field of computer architecture, but more from a historical standpoint, I guess, especially looking at women's specific roles in creating and developing this field and understanding like how their impact in it shapes like how we use computers today. It'll also kind of go into my own research and of sustainable computing architectures and kind of looking forward. So kind of be, the whole timeline almost, but very broad. I won't go into too many like technical details or anything like that. But if you do have any questions, please ask. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have along the way. So I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Marcus Chow. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in computer science, aspiring professor. That's kind of hopefully my job that I get after I graduate in a few years. But this is what I really am passionate about, and so this is kind of like me trying to like spread the word, I guess. So I'm currently living in San Diego. It's been all right. San Diego is fine, I guess. But more importantly, I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, whether you're in Riverside or back in your hometown or anywhere else. This is kind of a wild time, and it's important for all of us to think about each other and help each other out. So I transferred to UC Merced back in 2014. I was there for 2 years and graduated with my bachelor's in computer science and engineering. I then applied to Riverside for their Ph.D. program right out of undergrad. I didn't want to go into work or anything like that. I just wanted to go back to school. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the student life, I guess, and also the topics that I get to learn about computers. So I decided to go straight into graduate studies. And I got my master's in 2018, and I am now currently a PhD candidate. So plan on graduating hopefully within a few years, and I'm very excited for that. So I've taught a couple classes so far in Riverside. I'm not sure what year or level everyone's at, or if you're all CS or EE, but if you are familiar with the courses, I've taught CS 161, which is essentially Intro to Computer Architecture, and I've taught EECS 147, which is Oh, you're taking it? I'm not sure who's teaching it, but I hear that's always been a difficult subject for people. But I hope that it's not too hard for you. I really enjoy it. And then GPU architecture and parallel programming, I believe, is a very important topic, but it's not always taught very well. So um, I hope when I was teaching it, I had to teach it last spring, and that was very difficult. That was like at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I was just like very new. I have to say that. So both classes I've enjoyed teaching quite a lot. You know, this is something I'd want to do, and I'm not sure if anyone have been in my classes, but you know, I really enjoy doing it. So some of my work history as an undergrad, was part of the NSF Experience for Undergrads program at Texas State University. So that program, which I encourage um, any undergrads to try to take or try to go for. Maybe not now, but you know, but before everything got chaotic, is essentially a program where universities or professors who get grants from the NSF or the National Science Foundation, they essentially have to put on these research opportunities specifically for undergrads, and they are summer internships um, with universities, you know, with programs all over the country, all different types of universities. They usually put out like a list of everyone who's participating. There, like 100, you know, like usually there's quite a bit in computer science, electrical engineering, you know, mechanical engineering, any topic, because anything that gets funded by the NSF has to do it. And so you get a paid internship for 10 weeks. I got to go to Texas, which was pretty interesting. And, you know, I feel that's something, if you are interested in research as an undergrad, it's not always the easiest to kind of get into. It's very difficult and gatekeepy, but this is one way I think that undergrads can get a good opportunity to kind of like dip your toes into what graduate school is and what like research might actually like look like for you. So beyond that, I've also worked at AMD research. I was a GPU architecture research intern for the last two falls. So each one was like a 4-month stint. And I was working on their like supercomputer program. I think they've announced they're building some supercomputer for some government entity. So I worked on them. That was interesting. That was like my first experience in like a corporate environment or work environment. But if y'all are interested, I'll be happy to talk about that later. And then I'm currently working for a group in the University of Washington with their DARPA mini-core architecture project. So that's yeah. I don't really see the DARPA side of it because I'm kind of just like joining as like an individual collaborator, but it is very interesting so far. Yeah, and so that's me. And I kind of split this up into two segments, right? So we have sustainable computing architectures, we have like computing architectures, and then we have the sustainability aspect of it. So the first section I kind of want to go to, and so I guess this talk is like how I think about both of these. And so the first topic, right, is like, all right, what is, you know, a computing like architecture, right? And so, you know, computer architecture just very broadly, and I think, you know, perhaps more accurately than getting into anything specific, right? But it's just the design, functionality, organization, and just implementation of any system that does computations, right? And what it's primarily constructed out of, you know, if we separate it into like three components, is you have the hardware, the software that runs on top of the hardware, and the user who facilitates the software and operates the hardware, right? if you go more into this topic, these become more of a spectrum and they get split up very finely of like specific fields and everything like that. But very broadly, it just ranges from the hardware itself to the user. Right. So this hardware can be any physical components of a computing system, whether it be made mechanically, electrically, or made from biological material, right? If you think of yourself as something that does computations, right? And I think, and which I absolutely do, and is kind of the basis of what I think an architecture is. And it's designed, it's not just these components, right? These components are, designed to solve some computational problem. And what this problem may be can range from something that is application specific, right? This mouse is like slow. What I have here is an early or like very ancient. It's called the Chinese South Pointing Chariot, and it is a chariot that points south, and that is all it does. But you can move it in any orientation, and it still will compute using differential gearing system. It will compute where south is, right? So this is something that was designed specifically for one purpose, but it does some computation, or you can go all the way to some general purpose, like an abacus, where you can compute any numbers that you want, right? Given to the actual physical limit, but it can be any number that you need, right? So it can, it's as long as it does some form of computation, right? And the software on top of it is essentially just any set of instructions that directs this computer's hardware to perform a task, right? So some biological form, we may not know what our software is, but it's some thought process that you go through and developing your own intuition, right? Like some mechanically, these are punch cards that I'll talk about later. Essentially, there is a physical mechanism that either hits the hole or doesn't, and it represents a 0 and 1, and so it can mechanically represent a 0 and 1. And then we finally get to what you're more familiar now is actually typing out these instructions in either assembly or a higher level language, right? So the software again can be composed of anything as long as it's just a set of instructions, right? And then finally, it's the users. And so the only thing users are just any people who create software and operate the hardware. And these are just some examples of very smart women who were part of NASA program and were very integral to all of the different types of NASA programs in the 50s and 60s, right? They programmed most of the control systems that were used during that time. So I'll get to this later, but most of the people who programmed from the beginning up till now, right, are women. So the first computers, right, if we go back like to the beginning, right, and how I said before is like how I think of an architecture, right, is like foundationally it's like us, right? We are hardware, we have software and operators of ourselves, right? We have senses, our senses take input from the world around us and we compute what our actions are. And then we are also able to, excuse me, we're able to, take these actions and make these, compute something. Yeah, there's like plenty of lists. I'm not gonna, like, this isn't going to be straight, like just resuscitation of names. Most of the time is because there's actually very little recorded history of women's actual like input into the science fields, but women from all cultures and societies, right, have started and created the computing revolution like through their work in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and most importantly, is the foundation for what I believe like our modern computing sense is weaving, right? Um, and this weaving part is like something that is, I would say, like wholly like women's to that they have developed, right? Like in any culture from around the world, everyone has this some sort of tradition, and these this is where our sense of like a modern computer really comes from, right? But before they have done anything, right? Like the earliest that we can go back, or what we've known so far, or just like recorded history, right? Some of the earliest are like Mayan mathematicians, right? That we know that they've held like high respect for their mathematicians and scholars, and that we know that these calendars, right? They've developed calendars and counting systems that were like more like so accurate for anything in their time. Right? We're talking about like thousand BC. This is like before any other European like astronomer. Um, but we don't necessarily hear about them because they, um, because of like how European like scientists have you know um, narrated our whole view of like science, right? And many of these scholars were women, right? That we don't have like a name for, but we know that they existed, right? And so it's something that I think, like, before anyone says, like, why can't we like, or like why like how come we don't hear of these women, is because we don't have these written histories, right? Like one of the earliest ones that we have is this mathematician Hypatia, that one of the more famous ones, but only more famous because of her um, mythology kind of surrounded her that have been used throughout the centuries, right? But like what she was, right? She was a pagan mathematician, engineer, philosopher, most importantly, like a teacher in ancient Alexandria. And so she is the only, like one of the earliest female mathematicians that we have some recordings of. Yet, like, there's actually no images of what she actually looks like, right? If you Google Hypatia, um, then like you will get a couple of images, but these are just artists like imagination of, or there was like a movie made of her, and you'll find the actress who played her, right? And so like even if we have um, some written history, right, a lot of it is like piecemeal, and like there's something that to think about of when we do think of like what we consider um, like history, or perhaps the evolution of some like scientific field, right? It's not so straight, right? It's not so linear, right? There's so many people that we don't see, right? Especially um, when we do talk about things that aren't necessarily like considered like the scientific like domain, perhaps, right? Like weaving, right? And so this is part, like weaving is part of every single like human culture around the world, right? Like here I have like from the like Americas, Africa, Middle Eastern, European, and like Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islands, right? Everywhere around the world, there are women that have their roots in weaving, right? And weaving for a purpose, right? This weaving is for their community, for clothing their people, right? For um, keeping like their culture and traditions, and like passing down their own ideas and creativity, right? And like when I kind of was like looking for like, well, like I guess specific names, right, that we might see, like one of the few that I was like able to find was this woman Daisy Talgucci, I think is how to pronounce her name, but she is a renowned weaver from the Navajo Nation in the early 1900s. I think she passed away in like 1990. She like wove tapestries, rugs, clothes that won um, like praises and many awards in their national or in their tribal gala ceremonials, and her whole like weaving technique is praised for like these traditional designs that was still yet infused with her own creativity, right? And so this is something that like every and like yes, what she did is like amazing, but like and this is something that every weaver and every person who has done this, right, like shares um this like collective like culture, right, of weaving. Like another example is like the Tabali people, right? Um, Tanalak is a weaving tradition of the Tabali people whose patterns are specifically inspired by their dreams, and they come directly from their dreams. Like for them, they say like you don't have a pattern without it coming from their dreams itself, right? And so like they're known as like their dream weavers, and this is their whole um, and like this is their part of who they are, right? And it's this type of creativity that you don't necessarily um, get to see, or even like advancement, because um, you don't like, because we don't have these like individual names, but we do have these people and these cultures, right? And the idea that coming like weaving, like the idea that like our modern sense of like programming, right, like comes straight from weaving itself, right? So if you are not entirely familiar, weaving is essentially the idea of taking two sets of threads. One is the warp thread, one is the weft thread. Essentially, the warps go vertical and the weft goes horizontally, right? And so you have a warp thread that is woven either above or below a certain vertical weft thread, and having it woven above or below creates the pattern that you see. It either hides it or shows it, right? And but if you look into the actual like, or if you know look a little closer, right? Essentially, yeah, it's exactly this idea, or like it's interesting because like Conway's Game of Life should remind you of weaving patterns, right? I think it should be the other way around, right? So because this is like what it originally stems from, right? So you can visualize these patterns, you know, through a binary representation. It's either above or below, so it's either a 0 or a 1. These patterns are called drawdowns in weaving, and a drawdown pattern can actually be made to produce um, a non-repeating automata. And automata is essentially some, it can be anything that has some state to it, given an input and a set of rules of how to change state, essentially. Um, and so what that means is if something's repeating, then it just gets caught in a loop, and you can only do some, I want to say limited, but it's technically limited because all you can do is get from like the starting position back to the starting position, but you can still do some type of computation with these automatas. But you know, there have been people who have done the theoretical math of it, that it's actually possible to generate some Turing complete program woven into this fabric itself, because you're actually able to produce these non-repeating automatas into these patterns itself, right? And so there's a website, it's called like the Infinite Weft, where they actually have, you know, a virtual loom where it actually has, it's computing some, like I think they have something built in where it just computes some program, but you can actually like make it yourself, right? So this is like something that is inherent to weaving itself. Like I think I don't I want to like make this clear. Like, this isn't something that like some like people found after the fact, right? It's like weaving itself is this computational pattern, or this computational algorithm, I should say, that creates these patterns, right? Like for the topology people, these are patterns in their head that they have to compute in their head, right? And understand, like when you finish one row, how that first row affects what that second row should be, right? And so this is what I mean when it's, you know, weaving as code. These weavers are doing the same like logic as we might say a programmer does, right? And so like weaver programmers, like weaving is a global architecture that allows for, you know, someone's expression of ideas, dreams, creativity, culture, and traditions. Right? It's an architecture that is the direct ancestor of modern computing and has been created, developed, mastered, sustained, and taught by women for thousands of years for the benefit of their community, right? These weavers, they were doing it for their community. They are not developing, right, I don't know, disruptive weaving patterns for some corporation, right? This is how they thought, or like they use their skills and their ideas for their community, right? Someone had a question of that. I heard like a mic go on and off. And so, like, kind of moving forward in time, right? This is, I guess what I want to say is like, or what to get at is like, this is like the basis, right? This is what programming is, right? And I think this idea that, or like, I hope you feel some sort of connection to it, right? Because this is what you are doing as well as programmers, right? And people who are learning this trade, right? It's, I think it's important to think about like, what do you plan on doing, right? Because if it's just like weaving where, you know, it's done to, you know, pass down these traditions, right? Like many like weaving patterns are specific for like purely like ceremonial purposes or something like that, right? So like the same idea of a program is what are you passing down by creating these programs, and like what are you helping build by creating these programs? And so to make a more direct comparison, because even you'll find in this video, I guess I'll just show you this video first, because it really helps kind of understand, or I hope it understands like how this stuff is connected.
This is a mechanical jacquard loom. This technology was developed in France in 1803 by a weaver named Joseph Marie Jacquard. The key thing about this loom is that it controls every warp thread, the threads that go from the front to the back of the loom, individually. Because it can do that, the loom can create very complex, fancy patterns in the cloth more quickly and with greater accuracy than the technology available before this loom was developed. These cards are what carry the instructions that are read by the apparatus on the second floor that tells the loom what pattern to create. The holes in the cards are read by a series of pins up in the apparatus, and those holes tell the apparatus which threads down here should be raised for each pass of my shuttle across the warp. Some of you might recognize these cards as looking similar to computer punch cards. Back in the early days of computer technology, punch cards carried instructions that told the early computers what kind of calculations to do. So this loom is the great-great-great-grandfather of the computer technology that we all use today. And that technology started with a machine that produces cloth.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure about that joke, but I think that's funny. I guess to inform, more than what the video is, the computational revolution did not start with the loom, right? It mimics what women have been doing, for thousands of years before it, right? So if a lot of historians and computer scientists, they like to say this is the start of it. Well, if it's a machine that does something that humans already do, then you really do have to say, no, it starts way before that, where it actually started, women actually weaving it, right? And the intricate patterns is not necessarily enabled by this loom itself. It's from the people creating it, right? And women are able to create this, as intricate and as well crafted as anything else, right? Which I think, I feel like that type of language is something that you see in a lot of white computer scientists, and why I bring weaving up, and that it's so global, that it's is because, right, this is coming from all cultures, right? Primarily Black and brown cultures, right? And indigenous cultures. So this is where it actually starts. And kind of from that, right, all the way back then to, I guess this is the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. We don't have as many written history of that, right? And I guess just to put it up front, the people that I do mention from here to modern day, they are white women because of the way our society has treated women of color, right? So but to create that connection, right? I would think I would be remiss if I didn't include Ada Lovelace, right? She is well guarded as she's considered the first programmer, but as we can see before that, the weavers were still programming. What she programmed specifically was the analytical machine. And what she programmed, she theoretically wrote a program, as this machine didn't exist. It was made afterwards, but she still was a great mathematician and programmer, right? That was able to abstract away, instead of, right, this machine essentially was able to abstract away, instead of computing on some threads to move threads, up or down, as to create some pattern. Well, let's actually move an abstract thread to, a 0 or a 1 state, right? So this was kind of that, making this, right, if a loom you can think of as a little bit more application specific, right? It's very general, as in create any pattern, but it's specifically to weave things. And if we talk about it being a little bit more general, if you're able to compute anything, it's, I don't know. I think they're both general, but I think this is just one way to kind of look at that spectrum again, instead of it being wholly for one specific thing. And then after the mechanical revolution, right, it is we go into then we convert from mechanical computers to electrical computers, and I think in the in the marketing of this, I think I said to show women in, advancing the field of computer architecture, but it's kind of hard to show a little bit because they were shut out from designing the hardware itself, right? They were considered secretaries who program these machines. However, these women are still women who had to build the machine, fix them, right, correct any errors that came out of them, and program them, right, with only some wire diagrams that were given to them. And so these are, right, these were like companies filled, that had groups filled, groups just filled with women working solely on these machines because they take that much, like human effort to put into it. But however, all of this work again was, put onto these women who, most of the time, like, are not necessarily the ones who come to the forefront, right? Like there are a small group that at least have become some, or at least have some more renown to their name. They're the ENIAC girls. And so the fact that they were grouped together, right? These are 6 individuals, Marilyn, Betty, Kathleen, Ruth, Jean, and Frances. They were the ones who, the ENIAC is a machine, which is considered like one of the first electric and generally programmable computers. So essentially the first computer that we may kind of identify as the computers of what we have now, like electrical computers. All right, this group was the one that actually, physically maintained this machine. They were the ones that demonstrated this machine to an audience, to people, right? They were the ones in the background setting everything up. When it's, I'm not even sure which company it was, right? But which this company then says, like, look at this product that we made, right? When it's, in reality, this is something that was, maintained and created by these 6 women, right? And I think there was one more, to be honest, because I was reading something else that named a 7th, but I didn't necessarily I didn't make sure like what who this person was. But yeah, this was like, again, this is something that gets shut out from like our modern sense of what or who develops computers, right? And then moving on, after once everything was turned into electrical, right? We had the great shrinkage of transistors, right? From large vacuum tubes to small an integrated circuit transistor, right? Something that could be a transistor that it can be made directly into the circuit itself. So just done with some fancier wiring, essentially, right? And so during this conversion of from large scale to the small, right? We had this idea of very large scale integration, VLSI, which is still a big topic today, where it's like, okay, we're dealing with from hundreds to thousands to millions to billions of transistors, right? How do we collectively in our heads design something that when you get to, from just thousands to millions into hundreds of millions, right? And so one of the main people who contributed to this field was Lynn Conway, where she worked for IBM. And what she would do, because prior to this, essentially designing hardware components, you essentially had to know the physics of wires and the physics of the process of the technology and the design of it, right, at the same time to actually make something usable. But what Lynn's process was separating out the circuit design with the physical technology. So whatever it's made out of, you can kind of think about it separate of the circuit that it's making, right? And so having these two separate ideas kind of allows you to, I guess, compartmentalize okay, what I want to compute, how would I do it in one section, and then, okay, what is the actual physical components? And so this is why even like now, like as a computer architect, I don't really necessarily need to know um, the physical process of it, right? You might hear like chips talking about like 22 nanometers, like 7 nanometers, 5 nanometers, right? That's the process of how these chips are created. But you don't need to necessarily have a root understanding of that physics just to design something specific for yourself, right? And importantly, she didn't just like come up with this design tool chain essentially and just keep it for a single company, right? What she did was go around the nation to universities, teaching academics how to actually use this use this methodology that she created. And so this is something that she did, and eventually was fired from IBM in like 1968 for being a trans woman, one of the first trans women in America to go through gender affirming surgery, right? So this is like, and she is just starting to like be more of a name of it. Only like 60 years way too late. So it's I guess it's like it's tough, right? To try to convey how much like influence women have in computing when so much of it is hidden, right? And so much of it is purposefully thrown away, right? And so like I guess this is something like I had to like think about as I was like making this presentation, because it's like I didn't want it to be just listing names, but at the same time it's like it's without some like name to it, it seems a little bit more abstract, but which is like that's not necessarily like how it is, right? So women continue to be the driving force behind all different types of computing architectures without being credited or named, right? And so I think this is like the us part now, right? We come to modern computers, and so this is where like this is why we have right this group is like to understand like how important y'all are to this field and to just like the future in general, right? And so this is, I think, like the reason why I made this talk, I guess. Like I hope, yeah, I think I'll save it to the end. But yeah, so like, I think it's kind of tough because, like perhaps you had a different mental idea of what I might go over if you have ideas of what a computing architecture is. And I know certainly I get a lot of pushback of like, or not pushback, but just, I guess you can call it pushback of just like, think like, and talking to people who have just like one very specific conceptual idea of it, right? If you take 161, it's like just the 5-stage pipeline and that's it, right? Where it's like, yes, that is one way, but it's like, it's comes from, so much more. And I think that's the important part, right? And so like, I think, and it definitely influences what I think of like where we are now in computing and how it's like affected, the world that we live in. And so, my research is like, all right, well, how do we take what we have now, given, to us, and actually, see it sustainably through, right? This is something that can improve, or like we can do so much with it, right? Like, I think the magic of programming on a computer is like, I don't know, people throw the word Turing complete a lot, right? I think people just to be like, oh, you met some type of bar, but like what that means is you can do anything that you want. Like what it means to be Turing complete is that anything that can be computed on this machine, right? And so like that's anything. So like it's infinite to what it can actually do. And so I think, that's the power of these machines. But, what we have now is not necessarily, sustainable, right? Like sustainability is just the ability to exist constantly, right? And I kind of break it up into like these three categories, right? You have, it takes resources to create something, it takes resources to operate it, and it has to be accessible. And I think this accessibility part is the one that gets kind of left out of sustainability conversations, at least specifically within like computers, because it's like, oh, let's just make them more energy efficient or something like that. But if no one's able to use these things, or if only a small amount of people are able to use these things, then I don't know how sustainable you can call that, because it's like, if that small part was gone, then it would not exist, right? You need something to like be able to pass down and to continue and communicate it, right? And to actually have it make it grow into something more. And so, when we talk about the resources it takes to create, right? Electronics are comprised of various rare earth metals to manufacture. And this mining is done, primarily in like China, South America, and Africa, where it's destroying their ecosystem by doing this mining, right? It's creating this irreversible damage to the land, and it's polluting the environment, and where it endangers like the people that actually live there, right? And I think that's something that's that we don't see, of course, right? That like the computers that we use, like the phones that we buy every year, it's taking you're taking from the earth every time we create something like this. And so I think this is like I have, how do we reduce the amount of resources that we need? But I think another question also is how do we make sure what we are creating is something that's important, and something that is necessary, and something that is helpful for people in general, right? Not helpful for like a singular company, not a good product, but like what is it actually helping for, right? And so some of my research is I'm looking at like how do we use is to use the resources that we already have, right? So one of my projects is looking at like proportional computing in GPU data centers, right? Like we have these giant data centers, but most of the time, like they're always coming out with like, so specifically with GPUs, right? These companies are always coming out with like more powerful, but it actually, this chart is kind of archaic, I guess, and abstract, but essentially what it's showing, like this is some of my preliminary research, is that it's showing here that given the x-axis is the number of hardware resources that we give some program, and if we actually take it from 100% down to half, so we only give this whatever we're running, we give it half of the physical resources on this chip, it actually takes the same amount of time to run, or not the same amount of time, it takes I would say a very small performance hit compared to the amount of actual power that it uses, right? And if we see here, the power is at 100 watts, and if we do it halfway, now we're down at 80 watts. So it takes, right, we use 20% less power, but we also saved half of the resources. And so what we can do now is share the computing resources that we just freed up to have multiple people use this, right? So if this is, without actually taking any performance hit. So because of the way, right, this hardware is like created to be like more powerful, right? It's only going to be ever used fully in like purely like matrix multiplication and giant supercomputing applications, right? And this is not the applications that are used constantly, right? Those are only very specific that are done for, you know, something very, for a very small portion of time. Okay, I guess I gotta hurry up. Yeah, like some like kind of like future thinking of some like solar punks kind of stuff, which I kind of find kind of interesting, is the idea of fluidics as a computing source. So fluidics is we actually are able, people have made actual transistors using, you know, just fluids. So it's actually a physical, and so the 0 and 1 is translated from like the actual pressure of fluids. One of our professors at UCR actually works in microfluidics. And so instead of using like electricity, all it needs to do is drive these fluids through these essentially tubes through with a mechanical force. And so there's like ideas where you can have, you know, gravitational like computing architectures where essentially you line up from the top to the bottom, like the actual chip itself, and all you need to do is just drop fluid down and let gravity take it, right? It takes no energy. All you need to do is just essentially the energy to lift it up, which is far less than actually having electricity run through wires, right? Another way is perhaps like not using these, another way to like reduce these resources that we're using. People are looking at optics instead of using electricity. So using fiber optic wires that can essentially act the same as electrical transistors to not use these rare earth metals, right? The second like resources that it takes is it takes to operate these machines, right? So they're all electrical. Electricity still comes from, you know, dirty sources, petroleum, coal, and natural gas, and even cleaner energies like solar and wind and all that stuff. They still require or rely on rare earth metals like lithium, right? If we talk about like big batteries, like city scale batteries, they still take a lot of lithium. So not to say like that's not, we shouldn't like try to go for renewable energies. It's just another thing that we have to think about. So how do we reduce these energy requirements? So another project that I work on, this is one that I'm working on at University of Washington. I'm looking at this multi-core architecture in embedded systems. So why multi-core architecture may be, you know, energy efficient is essentially a bunch of tiny cores, like you can think of like the ones in your phone, but honestly even smaller than that. So they don't, like a single core doesn't do much, but if we just tile them all together, right, they actually become pretty energy efficient overall. And if we put that in an embedded system, right, we can have these small computers like the Raspberry Pi. You know, the Raspberry Pi can do any computation that it wants as any other computer. It's still a processor. Well, it only takes 5 watts instead of the, you know, 200 watts to run your desktop, right? And so this is, I think, kind of another way of understanding what do we actually need to run on these machines, right? So like people say, oh yeah, it doesn't, Raspberry Pi is not powerful, right? Or like it can't do a lot. But it's like, well, what do you actually need done that, you know, requires something that, you know, that much speed or anything like that, right? If most of our, you know, applications that we use are something that you can just do on your phone, right? Then like why still have these like 200, you know, watt machines? Another way people are looking at it is through neuromorphic computing, which is essentially a fancy way of, instead of using like a simple digital transistor, having a thing of like 0, 1, we could do like essentially it mimics how your neurons work, where the activation signal corresponds to like how much signal that it's coming in. So it's like a continuous function instead of a 0 and 1. It's all very out there, but also very like interesting. And like, this is like, I guess what I'm also trying to do is like show you some like future resource or future research that you may be interested in, right? And then finally, oh shit, what happened to this slide? But all right, so oh yeah, okay. Finally, like computing is not accessible, right? Especially hardware. There are only a handful of companies that have like resources to develop these processes, right? Like Intel, AMD, and NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Samsung, and like a couple more. All of these technologies, how their hardware actually works, right? We don't necessarily know, like public academics, other computer scientists, right? We don't know how, and it's barely even taught too in the university level, right? Like you take one course in computer architecture, but you have no idea, necessarily have no idea what's actually going on and how these processors are running your code, right? And like, and this is because like education and research is geared towards the industry, right? They don't necessarily need people, right? This is the same concept that happened in the 40s and 60s, right? A small group of people developed the hardware and then forced everyone else to essentially program for the thing that they made. And then they get to say like, look, wow, look how amazing this thing we made. And it can do all these things, but that it can only do all these things because people actually created something for them, right? So it's like, how do we make knowledge of computing technologies accessible to all, right? And like, so a third project that I've been working on is essentially kind of reverse engineering a GPU. So what we've taken, like in the idea of to develop a power and thermal model for one of them. So we have this thermal camera here that's actually able to, you know, record the heat signature of this chip. And essentially we can actually look, you might be able to see, you can actually see some details of like actually what's underneath the chip. And if we, you know, run something that stresses a single component, we can see it like light up, right? And so this is something, and then eventually we can build a model of how this chip actually, a thermal model of how this chip actually heats up, right? And so this is, again, would be useful if we're actually doing like embedded research on how to make chips like not so hot, essentially, right? Or you could possibly, yeah. So because we have to have the visual, like see the chip on top, right? Chips are usually put on with a giant heat sink on top because they will overheat and crash. So, well, we have to find a way to, some way to cool the system. And so we actually have a Peltier device. Peltier device is just some electrical device where you run electricity through it. One side of the Peltier device gets really cool. The other side gets really hot. So we put the cool side onto the motherboard, essentially actively cooling it, drawing the heat from underneath the motherboard. And then we run the hot side to, you know, a traditional like heat sink, right? And so, right, of course, we want to like open source our hardware, right? Allows for actual open education. RISC-V, if you haven't heard, is an open source computer architecture. You can actually like download, there's actually like cores that have been written in Verilog, and you could actually like download that core and like create it on an FPGA if you have an example, if you have one on hand, or you can actually like simulate the core itself, right? So and then you can like directly tune the like tweak the wires and everything, right? You actually have access to the wires itself. So this is what RISC-V is, what our many core architecture is based on. And then, right, most of you should have heard of Linux, right? I just put it out there to just be like, that's kind of, you know, one of the few examples of something being open source to actually being so like ubiquitous. However, Linux is still very much controlled, and this is honestly an issue of all open source projects, is I don't necessarily want to say controlled, but it's maintained at least by still a very few people. And I think that's mostly has to do with the fact that like, I guess I would say computer scientists aren't like the greatest at communicating like their ideas and communicating what is useful. So I feel like they always, at least like my experience, like programmers tend to think that it's easier for them to like just maintain all like the complexities in their head. So if something like messes up, then they can do it. They can just like fix something like quickly. And I think that's what happens in like open source projects where it's less complex if just a few people like know the whole program like very well, instead of having a lot of people know it not that well, right? Which is, again, something to work on. And like finally, a big part of my sustainability is like the ability to grow and make the community better. I want more people to participate, and the more we're able, like you are able to participate, the more we can contribute, and support each other. And I think that's like, for me personally, it was like why I got into this, right? It's something that I saw like the potential in, and something I like, found interesting, of course, but like I found interesting because like there's so much potential. And so, yeah, I guess that's, so I'm like, join the lab if you want. My advisor is Dr. Daniel Wong. I'm part of the SoCal lab. I put our email addresses and websites if you are interested. We're always looking for undergrads to kind of join us, and we have, and to do kind of whatever you want. I've had a couple of our undergrads have gone on to do the master's program here, so they've actually applied and do the master's. I have an undergrad that actually, is a co-author on one of my papers, right? So, yeah, I guess is like also me being like, hey, if you are looking for research opportunities, or if you have any questions of what grad school is like, feel free to reach out, because I want to like be there for y'all, right? And I guess I'm like over time, so thank you. That's all I got.
Thank you so much, Marcus. That was such an intriguing presentation, and you have definitely poked our interest into the topic. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. But I think you have answered anything that anybody could want to ask. And thank you for this wonderful session.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. It's great that y'all are putting this on. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has. I don't have anything to do. But yeah, will you? Oh yeah. It's a lot of Googling. But and it's like piecemeal. The other programmers have talked about it, and I can share a lot of my resources if I want with y'all. If there are, I can actually like pull some up. At least let me show you like one to get you started. But it is something that people have talked about before, and how do I stop? There. This was a workshop that was held in New York a couple years ago, but they also put in a bunch of other resources about like the connection of weaving and programming. But yeah, I can just that people have talked about before, but it's not haven't seen anything like, I guess, formalized maybe is the way to say it, but it's something that's there. And I think that's also like something that's hard to overcome. It's like, because there's not like, I don't know, a formal like talk about it, or it's very like hidden. It seems like we're just kind of like making, you know, abstract connections, but it, you know, it's really there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think maybe we can just wrap our session.